Friday night graphic novel discussion group. And we see some new faces here and probably some people coming in later. And this week, our choice selection was Woman Rebel, the Margaret Sanger Story, which was done by Peter Bagge. And we are very, very happy that Mr. Peter Bagge himself, the cartoonist, has agreed to have a conversation with us about his work, Woman Rebel.
I thought this was about Margaret Sanger.
So thank you. It is. So thank you very much, Peter, for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really good conversation, and we'll see what everybody thought of the comic. Peter, tell us. So let's start off with what brought you to Margaret Sanger?
Well, it was a long, windy road that brought me to that subject, but I'll try to make this long story as short as possible. I, over the last 20 or so years, I've been doing more and more both nonfiction comics and biographical comics. I started out just doing short pieces, like little one-page stories about this person or that. After a while, I started doing longer and longer pieces, started to think about doing a full-length comic book, and I became very interested in women, especially women who were very creative, women who were very active between the two world wars. I've noticed that there was a lot of there was this not very often spoken of attitude of freedom and independence that a lot of creative women exhibited at that time. And that got me to thinking about, why did they feel so free? This was before second wave feminism. And I wondered, were they using birth control? And if they were, what kind were they using? What was available? What was legal? Wondering about that led me to Margaret Sanger. And while reading about Margaret Sanger, I suddenly realized she would be the perfect subject for my first full-length biographical comic, just because she led such an amazing life.
Well, there's no question about it. It'd be interesting to hear what people thought of the comic. How did you approach devising the structure of your book in a biography?
Well, I hadn't done anything, like I said, I hadn't done a biographical comic full length, but I had done shorter pieces. But for me, I noticed it worked best if I didn't rely too much on like big captions. I didn't want the captions and all the panels to describe everything that was going on. I wanted the moment and the dialogue to carry everything. So all I would do is, as far as captions went, I usually would start a page with just like saying Paris in 1921, something like that. Just simply to establish time and place, and then try to write the dialogue in a way that the reader will then know what is going on and who is who and what is what. And all this while, I did know that, like, especially with somebody like Sanger, she mixed and mingled with a lot of very famous people, like, for example, H.G. Wells. But you can never assume that everybody knew all that first of all, you can't assume that the reader would know who H.G. Wells was, using just him for an example, let alone much lesser known people. So I saved a lot of information for the back notes. So there's like 30 pages of back notes after this 72-page comic. And there I would provide like background information, biographical information about all the people that factored into the story.
Yeah, the notes at the back were certainly very exhaustive. Let's see if anybody has any reactions to what they read. Does anybody have any comments on our selection this week, Woman Rebel? Don't know if anybody asked for the purchasing information, but I assume everybody got it.
Right.
Yeah, feel free to jump in what you thought of the book. I certainly thought it was very fun. It was very lively.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it just moved along very quickly. It's rather short, and it just keeps your attention. It's very engaging.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to dwell too much on any one aspect. You know, my feeling in general is that there's too many too many comics, too many graphic novels these days are a little too long. To me, they feel a little too dragged out. So I wanted to keep it short and snappy. I didn't want to test the patience of the reader. At the same time, I wanted to tell her whole life story. So it pretty much starts almost from beginning to end. I incorporated as much of her life as I could. The same with my other biographical subjects.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't read anything other than this one, Woman Rebel, but I do intend to have the rest of your bio comics under my belt someday. But I have been reading you since the days when actually I started when you were on Neat Stuff.
Oh,
I'm that old. Yeah,
that's
amazingly.
dating yourself.
Yeah. I have the comic ready to go here to share if we want to see some examples of it. If anybody wants to comment on any particular part of it. One question I would like to ask, and I probably will anticipate the answer to this, but by any chance, did the understanding that this was going to be a biocomic, did that in any way alter your approach to the art, the cartooning?
Yes. Well, I knew that with most biographical comics, well, throughout the history, whenever people would tackle a biological subject, usually the creators, the artist, the author, they would take a reverential approach towards their subject, assuming that the subject isn't somebody that's generally accepted to be a bad actor, like a Hitler, to give a most obvious example, that they seem to understand that there's going to be somebody reading it who they probably picked up the comic book because they have a lot of admiration for the person. So that's why it would usually be not just written, but also drawn in this very reverential manner. There's a certain generic, and I would argue somewhat boring drawing style that traditionally most biographical comics are drawn in. And there's nothing reverential about the way I draw. I draw in a very cartoony style. Mm-hmm. And so for that reason, I was a little bit nervous about me drawing it. And it did come true to some degree. Some people who are very interested in someone like Sanger, have a lot of admiration for her, they took exception to the way I draw. Their first knee-jerk reaction was I'm making fun of her. And it was the same with some of my other biographical subjects, but I wasn't. It's just simply the way I draw. And I would like to think that once people start reading the thing, that I did take my subject very seriously, even if I didn't put her on a pedestal. It's still human beings. Even people who accomplish great things, they're guilty of foibles like the rest of us. They're still human, and they still have their faults. And I didn't want to sugarcoat any of her shortcomings either.
Yes. Well, yes, it's lighthearted. It's a fun, lighthearted read, certainly. But I do agree. It's very respectful. It's respectful.
Oh, well, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Thank you. I hadn't heard of her particularly as the founder of Planned Parenthood, but I found her story really inspiring. The way you told it was quite inspiring.
Yes, well, thank you. Yes, she certainly, if nothing else, she was fearless. She really did live her life. And I shouldn't say that. Nobody is completely fearless, but she was so determined to accomplish her goals, to basically make birth control safe and affordable for all women. She was so hell-bent on accomplishing that she didn't let any obstacles stand in her way. So it's amazing she lived to a ripe old age for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very inspiring.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I think the quote, I'm going to mangle it. Anybody who has a why to live can put up with any adversity.
Yes.
Because she was very determined for her cause.
Right.
When you're living for a cause that's beyond yourself.
Yes, for the most part, that's very true. I mean, there were other things that were important to her too. But it was with her that her cause wound up being quite overriding. In her youth, she mainly was she was an avowed socialist back, I would say in the first half of her life, as were her father. Her father was, I get that term wasn't really so much in common usage back in the late 1800s, but her father, I guess, is what you could call a proto-socialist. So she was raised to think the way her father did and was very active with the Socialist Party. After a while, her you could almost say obsession with the birth control cause, it wound up causing her problems with the Socialist Party, where it's not like they were against it, but it's a very long-winded, but she wound up not denouncing socialism, but definitely causing a separation. She stopped being closely associated with the party, and also even politically, while she wasn't, in the last half of her life, she wasn't overtly socialist. She was more pragmatic because she suddenly found herself not just meeting with, but also even befriending people like John D. Rockefeller, all these millionaires who in the past she used to demonize. And part of how she got to know them is that they were the ones that gave her money. She got, she didn't get much money from fellow socialists, and she needed, like any organization, she started, originally it was just called it wasn't called Planned Parenthood. In fact, she hated that name. It was the National Birth Control League. She always hated the name Planned Parenthood. She thought it was too euphemistic. It was intentionally euphemistic, but yeah, she used to say, "What are we planning? A picnic?" she was, and also she was very much. She was not a team player. She was very much a person where it was like my way or the highway. She would not take orders from anybody else. And so as her own organization kept growing and expanding, she frequently found herself at great odds with her own organization, to the point where she had to semi-retire. She couldn't be involved with the day-to-day operations, which was by mutual agreement. She drove the rest of the organization crazy for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah. She didn't play the political game.
No. Well, also they were all, they all became very, she was the one that got the ball rolling when it came to fundraising, which was all important, the fundraising aspect. But there were also a lot of things about her that made the main thing too, that made them worry about what could kill their fundraising efforts is she had a very loose and wild private life. She had a lot of boyfriends, let's put it that way, and a lot of famous and accomplished men. And she very much believed in it, was an active participant in what used to be called free love, the free love movement, even though she was married. And that was always something that she worried about it as well. She didn't make it too public, this particular belief, but her fellow Planned Parenthood organizers, they really did worry about it, because religious groups in particular, the Catholic Church, they used to say the argument against birth control is it would make us all libertines. It's like sex has to have consequences, like say pregnancy. If women and men by extension, if you don't worry about an unwanted pregnancy, then we're all just going to go nuts and we're all just going to have sex with whoever we want. And privately, Sanger was like, for me, that's the point. That is the point. I mean, besides health reasons and also in economic reasons, that wasn't the point. I shouldn't have stretched that emphasis so much, but that was a major point. She was, that's one of the pluses. Excuse me?
At a point in history, though, sex outside of marriage was technically illegal.
Yeah, and by extension, birth control was illegal. When she started pushing it, it was illegal. One of the things, too, and this was another reason why it was so helpful to get wealthy, established, politically connected people, like, for example, John D. Rockefeller II, to get them involved, and she knew this for a fact, since she was a nurse, wealthy people had birth control. Even though it was illegal for poor people, wealthy people had access to birth control. And anybody with half a brain could see it. It's like, why is it that all the people who live on Park Avenue only have 2 or 3 kids, while we poor people in the slums are saddled with 8, 9, 10 kids? It's like, what are they doing? Are they not having sex? I don't think that's the case. It's like they were practicing birth control. And so she would, in a very roundabout way, shame them. And a lot of them were, she did effectively shame them. They said, yes, this is hypocrisy because everybody in positions of power, judges, politicians, you name it, we do use birth control. We have as many kids as we want. I'm a rich guy. My rich wife doesn't want to have more than 2 or 3 kids. You know, it's going to make her body go to hell. We want to keep it nice and simple. But we are also supporting this society, this legal apparatus that makes it impossible, legally impossible, for poor women to do what we're doing. And that had a lot to do with how over time she was also by pretty much stopping to demonize the rich and powerful and befriending them and talking to them on a face-to-face basis. That is how that was a big way that she got things to change and the laws to change.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think if there's any way forward, it's going to have to be an integration of all political viewpoints. We should,
yes.
I mean, that would be the ideal, I think.
Yes.
Because there's no right or wrong. It's just there's different perspectives, and we all have to learn how to work together as a collective.
Right. Yes.
Do you think that would have come from her pacifism or her anarchism, or whatever you say?
Well, she was, she was a pacifist. She was very anti-war, and she never used violence. It's probably something that goes all the way back to Thoreau, but one of her heroes was Mahatma Gandhi, and she greatly admired him because he changed so much. He changed India, but did it without the use of violence. But the problem with that, of course, is when you practice nonviolence, you're setting yourself up, like Gandhi, to be killed. You're an easy target. So that was always a concern as well. And that's something that concerned her family. But she knew that her cause, or any cause she was involved with, which included the anti-war movement, she was involved with a lot of things, especially in her youth. She knew that practicing violence would kill it. It would destroy anything that they were trying to accomplish. It'd be too easy for example, the press, the news media, and politicians to demonize you if you yourself have to resort to violence to further your agenda. She wasn't an anarchist. A lot of her friends were. There always was, and there still is, but back then, like in the 1910s, there always was this uneasy alliance between socialists and anarchists. The socialists believed in the state, anarchists don't. And so if one or the other took over, the other side would be out of luck. But they always did work together. She worked very closely with especially Emma Goldman, who was a very famous anarchist. And even though their idea of a perfect government or a perfect way for people to be governed, even though it differed wildly, let's put it this way, they had the same enemies. And Emma Goldman was just as dedicated to, for example, birth control as Sanger was.
We've got a lot to thank for Sanger.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I would agree.
We in America, certainly, yeah.
Yes, and everywhere, by extension.
Everywhere follows you anyway.
Yeah, there were people who were doing what Sanger was doing pretty much in every country. She had close alliances with, I can't remember her name. I always forget how to pronounce it, but there was a woman in Japan who did an awful lot to bring birth control to Japan. And there was a woman, God, I can't remember, Stoke, was that her name? She was a advocate of birth control in the UK, and pretty much was Britain's version of Margaret Sanger to some degree.
Have you heard of Tahirih in Iran?
Who?
Tahirih in Iran?
No.
Made off in 1848. And it's celebrated by the UCLA every year. Tahirih, she was a poetess. She was a very, very knowledgeable woman. And she was one of the Babi sect religion.
And she was from Iran, from like the middle of the 19th century?
Yes.
Oh, no, I'm not familiar with.
Amongst the men.
Oh,
and
really?
Of the men cut their throats and they ran away. And she said they killed her at age 30 years. They suffocated her and dropped it in a web by the order of the Shah. Actually, Shah wanted to marry her first, Nasruddin Shah. He rejected with a beautiful poem. He said, all those luxury for you. I am very happy where I am.
Huh.
Wow.
Somebody here, somebody wrote from Metalia wrote Ishimoto Shitsui.
Yeah, that's her
a
name.
woman from Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, that's you. You sent that?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing that. That was very quickly. Sanger, because I was saying before, she was very headstrong, was not a team player. She usually had a lot of trouble working alongside with most of these other women, most of these other birth control advocates. Chisui was an exception. The two of them got along great. She adored her. And I think in her lifetime, she visited Japan 5 times, mainly to be with her. She loved the country of Japan, but she really loved hanging out with her cohort.
Did she ever get to Australia?
No, that's probably one of the few places she hadn't been. She had to, and she pretty much throughout her adulthood, she suffered from tuberculosis, and very often thought she was going to die, but still somehow managed to live to be 86.
Yeah.
And even though she claimed to be a non-smoker, that wasn't true. There's photographs of her smoking. She was a very naughty TB patient.
Yeah.
And also at one point too, her son, both of her sons were doctors, and her older son, as Sanger was getting older, he was worried that she was drinking excessively. And so he claimed, and she claimed, that he helped her get her drinking under control. But I've since my book came out, I'd since learned that that wasn't true at all. Like on one of her trips to Japan, this is back in the day when people would take ocean liners, and she'd be spending weeks and weeks crossing the Pacific. And she was in her 70s at this point. And she was a small woman, a very small, slight woman. But she met Robert Heinlein, the science fiction writer.
Did she?
Yes,
wow.
And he knew who she was, and he wanted to talk to her. And he was in his 70s. No, she was in her 70s. He was a much younger man and a big man. He was like 6'4", and I guess by then still in his 30s, maybe 40 at the most. But they wound up drinking. They got into a drinking contest, and she drank him under the table. She drank him unconscious.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And this is according to Heinlein.
Yeah.
In his own autobiography, he described this story.
Well, I'll be. My goodness me. I think I might have read that a long time ago, many decades ago. But wow, how about that? I can see a commonality between the two. I can.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Kindred spirits.
Yeah, just on some level. The floor level.
Well, a lot of the political ideas and ideologies in Heinlein's later work,
right,
even earlier work,
right.
Sanger would have rubber stamped them, I think.
Yeah, well, they both they wanted, and she too. She wouldn't describe herself, like I said, she would have never described herself as an anarchist, a non-statist in any way, shape, or form. But she did clearly. She wanted, at least for one aspect of people's lives, women in particular, but like I keep saying, by extension, that would include everybody, was just having control over your own body, your own biology, and to be able to do what you want with your body without constantly worrying about pregnancy, because pregnancy means you're suddenly a mom, or you're a mom yet again. You're a mom for her mother had 18 pregnancies. She had 11 children that grew to adulthood, but she was pregnant 18 times. Her mother spent her entire adult life pregnant and or nursing. She was always one or the other, and she loved her mom, but she also was like, this is not only is this not for me, this isn't for anybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
That's certainly the one of the feelings I got from reading this story was frustration, just frustration at the how slow it is to change
Right.
civil orientations and how we behave and our ideas of good and bad and right and wrong. And progressive ideas are just so slow. It takes generations to
Yes.
go, and you get frustrated.
Yes. Yeah, no, real change is extremely difficult. Real meaning, like as it's experiencing now, it's like in the wake of what happened that everybody saw with George Floyd. And that led to all these protests all around the world, but specifically in the United States. And where everybody wants criminal justice reform and change, real meaningful change about how the police do things. And a lot of politicians, especially like in this country, a lot, Democratic politicians, they've given a lot of lip service to the protesters, but they are doing absolutely nothing to affect real change. No laws are being changed.
Yeah.
All the laws that exist, the way we do things now, they haven't changed a bit. In spite of a whole summer of protests, they haven't changed at all. No law has changed. There's been zero meaningful change. So obviously, if this is a subject that would include me, that you feel has to change, we haven't come close to getting the job done. Because it always has to do with people who have vested interest in the status quo. Like in Sanger's day, for one thing, that would have been the Catholic Church. That was her, even though she was raised Catholic, they were her biggest nemesis. The Catholic Church, and back then the Catholic Church had in the United States had a lot more political power than they do now. At least back then it was more overt. The Catholic Church was much more overt about trying to get their religious beliefs sanctioned by the state. And that would include banning birth control. So her whole life, she spent mainly fighting this monolith, which was the Catholic Church. People used to always joke that Sanger needs the Catholic Church because of their resistance, they help her raise money, but also the Catholic Church needed Margaret Sanger because they needed a witch. They needed somebody to demonize and point at and say, you see what would happen if you don't listen to us and you listen to her, all hell will break loose.
What was the reaction that you got when this was first published? It came out 2013, I believe. Yeah.
Well, mostly positive. Again, other than people who didn't like the way I draw. For people who actually read the thing, overwhelmingly very positive. I did get some very negative comments from people who, if I would engage them at all, first based on what they would say, like comments they'd post online or things they would say to me if they'd email me, it would be really obvious they didn't read the book. And there's Sanger still is. In fact, I would say she has been more than she has in the last, since her death, which was 50 years ago. She is very demonized, and this demonization, this mischaracterization of her as a bad person is a total invention of people who are pro-life, people who are against legalized abortion. And at some point, I'd say maybe 20 years ago, around the same time as like the beginning of the internet and social media, somebody from the pro-life movement, they said, a good way of hurting Planned Parenthood would be to demonize their founder, Margaret Sanger. So let's go after her. And I don't know if these people really, if all of them, certainly not all of them, if they all really believe the things they say about her. But, the biggest lie, the biggest distortion, the biggest lie was Sanger was motivated to do all of this because she wanted abortion to be illegal. And that is like, that's her biggest haters are people who are pro-life, who are against abortion. They are without a doubt her biggest haters. And what's so weird about that is Sanger died in 1966. And at least in this country, abortion wasn't legal until 1973. So it was like a good 7 years before Roe v. Wade. And the other thing too is Sanger never pushed for the legalization of abortion. And here's the other thing too, that most people find impossible to believe, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice. People have such a hard time believing this, but there's proof of it. There's no proof of the opposite. Sanger was against abortion. She thought abortion was murder. And so here all these people are so invested in making her this angel of death. Some people even say that she invented abortion. And she was against it. She thought it was murder. That was yet.
Sorry.
What was that?
Yeah,
but religious, wasn't she?
She was not religious. She was spirit. She was raised Catholic. Her mother was a devout Catholic. Her father wasn't. Her father was a radical, but she was very spiritual, but it was very much her own spirituality, you know.
Okay, so that doesn't affect her views on abortion in any sense?
No. And also when people would grill me about this, they would say, why was she like in particular, why would she feel so strongly against abortion? It probably I'm sure it had an awful lot to do with her time. She was a nurse. That was her job. She was a trained nurse. And she had witnessed the end results of many botched abortions, many women who attempted to abort themselves with a coat hanger. And it would wind up with sepsis, which is a horrible way to die. A terrible, horrible, awful way to die. So it could have been, at least a big part of it could have been visceral, you know. So even though she was a nurse, she had a really hard time dealing with any kind of procedure like that, anything that didn't fall into professional medical protocols. Like, for example, one time when she was a student nurse, no, she wasn't even a student nurse, she was already experienced, but they had an intern, a young male doctor, and he started to do a surgery on somebody. So he stuck the scalpel into the patient, who was unconscious, but then he forgot something because he was new to this. He forgot something. He forgot to grab sutures. He forgot to grab something else. So he went to reach for it, and he left the scalpel just dangling out of the patient. And Sanger passed out. The sight of just the mere fact that he stepped outside of the protocol, the sight of all of a sudden that wasn't a surgical tool. It suddenly was a knife sticking into somebody's body. And when he let go of it and walked away, it suddenly in her mind, it completely changed what that tool was. And she suddenly was looking at gore. You know, she was suddenly looking, yeah. And so I imagine that had a lot to do with her feelings about abortion, especially back in the days when it was illegal.
I've heard that. There's a way of the mind works to compartmentalize certain activities that ordinarily.
And if you're a doctor or a nurse, you have to be able to decomp.
Yeah, especially, yeah.
You have to be able to separate.
In the context of operation, you think of it one way, but outside of that context, you would feel completely different.
Yes, exactly.
I'm just looking through her Wikipedia. Was there any link to eugenics, or is that sort of a slander?
Yes, and that's another thing too. Again, this began with this is something that has been, well, let's put it this way, greatly amplified by the pro-choice movement. It used to be like, again, eugenics. When that subject comes up, I do not know where to begin, because these days when people use that word, your mind, almost everybody's mind, they hear the word eugenics, they immediately go Nazi. And it never was that simple. Eugenics is Greek for good genes. And it was all about improving humanity. And everybody had, just like people have different ideas about everything politically and otherwise now, it was the same back then. So people had different ideas about how to improve the next generation. So for example, if you believe in prenatal care for a pregnant woman, if you think it's important that a pregnant woman does certain things, takes good care of herself to ensure or to help ensure that her yet to be born baby will be healthy and grow up to be a healthy adult, you're a eugenicist. That was like, eugenics was like part of the beginning of things like that. And so there were a lot of people who, pretty much back then, almost everybody believed in eugenics except for devout Catholics. And you could probably find usually somebody who's extremely conservative in their religious views, but it mainly was the Catholic Church was the only people back then who were openly against eugenics. What killed eugenics, what blew it up and destroyed their reputation, is there was a divide, and part of the divide was some people say, well, when we're talking about better genes, that doesn't include certain races and ethnicities. But a lot of those people too believed in something called positive eugenics, which meant they weren't going to go so far as to say we should kill off all the undesirables. But what they would say, and this would include American presidents like Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, they said this publicly. They said people with the right genes, which meant white Protestants, white Northern European Protestants, they should have more babies. And of course, and Sanger was against that notion for all kinds of reasons, but they were part of the eugenics movement. Again, I know, sorry if I'm going on too long, just really quickly, what Sanger did was, and this is very ironic. It's so ironic considering how people are using the word eugenics to destroy Sanger's reputation. But what she didn't care that much about all the politics involved with the eugenics movement. All she wanted to do was give the birth control movement legitimacy. It was not legitimate. It was considered gross. It was not something you talked about in polite company because it involved sex. It was very difficult to talk about, especially when you talk about what it was, how it works. You can't talk about the use of birth control without talking about people having sex, without talking about coitus. And so a lot of people just simply wouldn't talk about it. So she said, well, but it is important. It should be part of the eugenics movement because it means that mothers' babies will be healthier. If they have fewer babies, if they space the births, they could afford more time and attention to each one of their children. This is better for the future generation. And that's and so she said the eugenics movement should accept me, and they wouldn't. Here's the ironic thing: is people who were leaders in the eugenics movement, they said this woman Margaret Sanger, she's desperate for legitimacy, and she's attaching her movement to ours just to piggyback on us. We're legit. She isn't. She's just using us, and they were right. That's the ironic thing is they were right. She was just using them. It was just she was trying to steal their legitimacy. Now it's so weird that you won't find anybody who says I'm against birth control. Yeah. I'm sure they exist. Nobody says that out loud anymore. But everybody claims to hate eugenics based on what we know of it, what we understand of it. It's like, oh, that was terrible. So it's so weird that back then the eugenicists were like, keep this birth control person away from us. She'll destroy our reputation. She just wants to steal our great reputation. So there you go in a nutshell. Yeah. That's Sanger's that is her association with the eugenics movement.
You mentioned a religious group who in that time were against eugenics. Why were they against eugenics?
The Catholic Church. Well, just because of Catholic dogma and that to them, they believe very strongly in it. And I was raised Catholic. They believed in it when I was growing up, that, it's just God doesn't make mistakes, regardless of the circumstances. When a woman gets pregnant, you have that baby. And of course, you should get married. You should marry the father, even if the two of you hate each other. And of course, the reality is far more complicated than that. What if the father of a woman's baby is her father? The Catholic Church just didn't talk about that. They just simply pretended things like that don't happen, or if they do, we won't talk about it. It was just very much, this is the way it's supposed to be. Every conception is a miracle. That you're a human being from the moment that you're conceived.
Every sperm is sacred.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter even trying to improve things. So they were what?
No, the Catholic Church has been incredibly slow about. They're still are just taking baby steps when it comes to this sort of thing. That sex only serves one purpose, and that is to make babies. And
women don't.
And of course, in many ways, it's a denial of reality. That's another thing too, that a wall that Sanger constantly hit and had a very difficult time addressing is, well, first of all, as many women as men were opposed to birth control. Her staunchest opponents were women. And these days, people, like, especially if you talk to a young feminist, they think, well, it was the men, it was the patriarchy that was preventing birth control from being legal. But during Sanger's lifetime, she had as many male colleagues and male allies and male supporters as she did female supporters and allies, and the opposite. She had as many female enemies and opponents as she did male enemies and opponents. So it was pretty much, the split was pretty much gender neutral. But a lot of the female opponents would always say, well, women just, say no. They just have to learn how to say no to these men. But when you'd get more into this, when she'd get deeper into this conversation, the point was always, women don't really want to have, it's the men that want to have sex. Men, you know how men are. Men want to have sex, and they'll do or say anything to have sex. And women don't. And that drove her crazy. But especially even amongst her friends and colleagues, she's like, why, we as women, why do we have to pretend that we don't want to have sex? She goes, I want to have sex really badly, with men. I want to have coitus with men. Again, like I was saying before, that was a big part of why she was in favor of birth control. She goes, I love that stuff. And she goes, why am I supposed to pretend that I'm doing men a favor? She goes, I suppose there are some women that feel that way. A lot of women claim to feel that way, that they're doing men a favor by having sex with them. They're simply indulging them. She goes, I don't feel that way. She goes, I'm indulging myself. So but she had a very difficult time talking about that without making her sound like a tramp, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, because the Catholic churches put their ideals on society, not just men, not just women.
Yes, and also, and it wasn't just for her, especially since she drove the church crazy also in part because she was raised Catholic, and she's Irish Catholic by origin. Over time, a group that became even more vocal in their opposition to, well, particularly with abortion, but also when it comes to what we're talking about here, is evangelical Christians, just extremely conservative, fundamentalist Christians who aren't Catholics, but they've become even more boisterous and more politicized in the United States over the last 50 or so years than even the Catholic Church. If anything, they've mellowed on this subject, whereas not all Protestants, but certain aspects of Protestantism has become the biggest and noisiest opponents to what she was trying to do.
I didn't think of going in this direction, but now that I'm thinking about it, we certainly can. I mean, the situation now of what's going on, I mean, we've got now a very, very, very solidly conservative Supreme Court with Amy Barrett. And that's going to be for a generation. And now, so these issues are very, very present now.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, I don't know. From my experiences, with some exceptions, Supreme Court appointees are never exactly what you think they'll be. First of all, the assumption is always, if a Republican appoints somebody, he's got to be a right winger. If a Democrat appoints somebody, he's got to be a left winger. But it's rarely, there are, and sometimes, yes, that is the case, but very often they're not. And you can't predict. You never can really quite, like already with the first, I can't even remember his name now, but the first appointee of Trump's, he was, of course, people who were opposed to the Republican Party and opposed to Trump, they were like, he's going to be terrible. He's going to be a nightmare. He just appointed Hitler. And he's been nothing of the kind. He's been a moderate. He's been very much, so you never know. And the same with Barrett. You just, I'd say wait and see, but usually we're support. They tend to, of course there's exceptions, but they always wind up more in the middle than not, So we'll see. I don't know. If you're asking me, though, if I think, especially with the addition of Barrett, that we're going to illegalize abortion, no. Just for strictly pragmatic reasons, we will never illegalize abortion. There's a lot of politicians, especially on a state level, in states like Kansas, where they'll pass, like just on a state level, they'll pass laws that make abortion pretty much impossible to get, a legal abortion, and then a state court It doesn't even have to go to a federal court. A state court will quickly overturn it, saying, no, this is unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder why and they're almost always Republicans, why do these Republican politicians keep passing these laws knowing that they'll get overturned? And it's fundraising. That's how they raise funds for the re-election campaign. They'll turn to the people who are most, they're so passionate, just like people on the left are passionate. They give a lot of money to birth control, who in turn gives a lot of money to Democratic candidates. And that's why we have this theater. It's all theater when it comes to birth control with pro-life and pro-choice. And first of all, most of these politicians, they don't even believe what they're saying, but it raises funds. It gets them money. There's lots of people who are sitting at home saying, oh, that guy's doing everything he can to make abortion legal. I'm going to give him all my money. And so he'll do he'll go through the motions, even pass a law, sponsor a law, promoting making abortion illegal, but he also knows it's going to get tossed. So it's pure theater, and it's all about making money. That's why I think abortion will never be illegalized. Maybe I'm overly optimistic. In case you can't tell, I'm pro-choice.
What were some of her shortcomings and weaknesses? I'm just curious.
She was a terrible wife, which to some degree, you could attribute that to the fact that she was, again, like to use the euphemism of the time, a free love advocate, a free love practitioner, although her husbands knew that. Both of her husbands knew that, officially accepted it, but it also caused problems. And
what do you mean? I'm sorry to interrupt. What do you mean by terrible wife? How do you define terrible?
Negligent. I shouldn't say terrible. But I would very few people want to be married to her. She was hardly ever home. And here's an example. I'll give you an example, especially with her first husband. He was a nice guy, but he had emotional problems. I would say, like, if he was alive now, he'd be diagnosed manic depressive. And
so perhaps he was a terrible husband.
No, but it made you understand why she would want to keep away from him. That he exhausted her. It wasn't this way when they first married, but he became very needy. But also his neediness towards her was exacerbated by the fact that she was getting more and more active and even becoming famous. She was becoming.
And then when her children were getting older and she was being threatened with arrests and got arrested, and with the Comstock laws, she left the country in order to be a mother for her children.
Well, she didn't bring her children, though. She left her children with her.
She left the country so that her children would
let's put it
have their mother put in jail.
Right. And she didn't
and
know
her kids did come to visit her several times when she was
not then. No, they didn't. She didn't see her children for a very long time. And then when she came back, the kids were she agreed to it, but they put them in a very cheap private school for run by socialists, and the dorms that their kids were in were unheated, and her daughter caught pneumonia and died, which of course she felt she wasn't I shouldn't have said horrible, but especially with her second husband. I'm hard pressed to find fault with him. And it really seemed like what mainly attracted her to him is he was a millionaire. And he wanted to be with her. I mean, he knew before they got married that she had lovers, and that wasn't going to change. And he understood that, but he wanted to see her more often. And when she'd go on a trip, he would say, how long are you going? She might give him an answer, but she always would stay longer. And what she would do, and this is according to her, and she seemed to think this was funny. I didn't think it was funny at all. But one time they were on the phone. She was about to come back home to him. And he said, you've been on the phone. He got angry. He said, he's just simply missing her. And he said, you've been gone so long. You told me you would have been back a week ago. Can't you come back now? I want you to come home right now. And what she did, even though all he was doing was missing her, and he was upset that she was gone longer than she said, what she did to punish him is, without telling him, she went to the Bahamas and spent 2 weeks in the Bahamas. And he had no idea where she went. And that's what I meant by not a great wife. And we know that story because she told us that story. She thought it was cute. She thought it was funny that she did that. That was a horrible thing.
Cute or
she
funny,
was
but
punishing her husband for missing her.
I would suggest that perhaps we don't know her motivations, although there are stories in her words. But another one, at least in all the sources that I've read, another one of her biggest motivations was the socialist motivation of equality of income. And she was invited lots of different places at the last moment to go and talk to groups of, especially groups of women, to talk about the hegemony of male processes, you know, and the Simone de Beauvoir world of naturalizing a certain role for women. That was what got her into more of the trouble with the Comstock laws, than her particular individual attitudes towards her relationship of her husband, who also was having affairs, because they were socialists and radicals.
Right.
And that's what people were doing in the 1910s. And the Comstock laws were also, you know, being influenced by people like Mae West, who at the same time that Sanger was doing her health care work, which she identified the work she did as health care. She thought that it was not fair that poor women didn't have access to knowledge and hygiene.
Are you coming into this conversation just recently? Because we talked about all of this earlier.
I've been here since the beginning.
Okay, so I was talking about her involvement with the Socialist Party.
Yeah, but you said she wasn't a socialist or
no, I said she was. I said she was very involved with socialism. She was unapologetic advocate and participant in the Socialist Party and everything they believed in, and that, but at a certain point that very much changed, and so what you just described would describe the first half of her life. She was a bit. It's not like she did a 180, but she was different after that. By I would say like around when she came back from England, experienced you know, and did wind up going to court and did spend some time in jail. But yeah, like much of what you said is true. There's no evidence that even though her husband, her first husband, even though he believed that people should be allowed to practice free love, and that would include his wife, he didn't. That isn't true that he had lovers. He didn't. And neither did her second husband. They were both very dedicated to her, in spite of, especially with her first husband's issues, his mental issues, which weren't there when they met, but seemed to get exacerbated as time went by.
Yeah. Well, when she was arrested the first time, she was under the Comstock laws. She was arrested for publication of family limitations.
Correct.
Which was her manual. And I think your assessment that there was a societal unacceptance of talking about reproduction in general and female genitalia and reproductive genitalia. So I think that from what I've read about Comstock and the other people involved in putting down all people who were talking about basically the freedom of the body, which was manifesting itself in various forms of discussion and various forms of social action. But certainly her perspective was that of as a community nurse. She basically invented community nursing. And she would go to poor women's houses and show them how to clean themselves. And part of it was to prevent unwanted pregnancies, because they were having multitudinous pregnancies because they didn't know how to not have pregnancies, and then dying young and leaving all these orphans and children who were not able to be cared for. So I think, you know, it's just always very interesting in what sources you read, what kind of perspective underlies the source material. And certainly I admit that my academic study of Sanger has been from a feminist point of view and has been from a Beauvoirian approach to really trying to unpack the naturalization of roles of male and female, and especially reproductive roles. So I would, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. I didn't even realize that you had a book. I just thought it was a picture. And I came in late, so I admit to that. But I'm actually a theater writer and playwright and producer, and I've actually written plays about Margaret Sanger. So I have an enormous amount of research.
What is the name of the, at least
It's
one
called
of the?
Wonder Broads. And
Okay.
it got the Oregon Book Award for the best play in 2000. It's about women who changed the world in the United States.
Yeah. Are you American? I'm guessing you're American yourself.
Yeah. So I'm appreciating these other people that are mentioning more international sources for, but I specialize, I guess, in my academic approach. I specialize from the New York women's rights, the original women's rights conventions in 1848, Seneca Falls, and those women, and Harriet Tubman, and that whole beginning, which was certainly had some religious base to it, and the religious base was often in the more thoughtful and less dictatorial perspectives than, say, early Catholicism, but also in those same things, the early Baptist and the early Lutheran movements, who were also religious, exiles from their home societies, also had enormous stigma against women's rights to their own bodies, and it's reflected in the South of the United States too, in slavery. And attitudes towards the enslavement of people. Women were allowed to be enslaved, especially wives were allowed to be enslaved, because that was their natural role in life. So for my study, the biggest problems that Sanger got into from a philosophical and from a legal standpoint was not that she was a profligate, but that she was talking from a medical standpoint about how to prevent getting pregnant.
Right. Yeah. No.
So that people didn't starve and die.
Sure. No. We earlier on I went into great detail about all of that.
No, you mentioned her being a nurse, but you didn't mention being her nurse as the most important thing in her life, which is what she said about herself.
Okay.
And that's the only reason that I'm arguing with you about this point, is that we all have our perspectives on things, and because my perspective has been from a progressive, liberated feminist point of view and a historical feminist point of view, I think it was just getting a little bit too, she was a bad wifey to me, and a little too not quite nuanced enough.
Well, again, Melinda, you've missed a lot, and you seem
I was here from the beginning.
I get is that it seemed like you came in right when somebody asked me what were her shortcomings.
No,
and it sounds like that's where you jumped in and you responded. You're saying a lot of the. I talked about her career as a nurse. I did. We did talk about that and how much that shaped her. Yeah, we did talk about all of that.
Yeah.
Maybe I could just ask, what were her views on love? Did she ever talk about it? Did she believe in it? What did she? I know she's more freewheeling. What were her thoughts on?
Well, she was
love?
well, for one thing, she was not just to her own family. She came from a very large family, but and she was close to them. But her and her three sisters, they were practically attached at the hip. Which sometimes could lead to problems between them, but she was extremely close to her family. She was close to her children, and the one that died, I was talking about earlier, the one that passed away from pneumonia. So, well, her name was also Margaret. She called her Peggy, but Sanger actually named her daughter after her, and clearly had great hopes. The girl was only 7, I believe, when she passed away, but when somebody before was asking about Sanger's spirituality, Sanger, and this was quite common, especially back then, for women who lost a loved one, particularly a child. She got very much into seances, and was mainly took part in seances to keep in touch with her daughter. So she had this, she was, that on the days of her daughter's birth and the day of her death, she would lock herself in her house and not see anybody or talk to anybody. And the main reason she took part in seances was solely to talk to her daughter. And she was convinced that her daughter grew to adulthood in real time, but in a separate parallel universe. So again, now I'm talking about before, I'm also addressing when somebody was talking about her own spirituality. So there's that. And, but yeah, she, in her own way, she was very dedicated to her children, but also, you know, she had a powerful personality, a really big ego. So it's not surprising that, like, first of all, like, she named her daughter after her, and you could tell that you get this feeling that she envisioned her daughter to be the first woman president. She had clearly had the highest hopes, even though the girl passed away at 7. But Sanger, even though she was a nurse, and that was very much her identity, like Melinda was saying, but she had thwarted hopes herself of becoming a doctor. And she had the utmost respect for the medical profession. And so, again, it's not too surprising that both of her sons became doctors, very much at her urging and almost insistence. They both went to Cornell in upstate New York. That's where she wanted to go. That can't be an accident that her sons both became doctors and both went to Cornell's medical school, because that's what she wanted for herself.
Well, that's love for her children. What about romantic love? Did she ever talk about that? Or
Yes, well, she again, it's like I didn't mean to sully her private life, but she, you know, when I was talking about, you know, the fact that she had numerous lovers and enjoyed sex with men, but she would speak about sex also in a very spiritual way. To her, it wasn't purely physical. And so whenever she would talk, you know, it wasn't just, oh, it feels really good. She never talked about it as this purely animal thing. She always would talk about it as a spiritual thing. So while, like, with the men that she was involved with, while I suppose it didn't hurt if they were attractive or had money, she primarily was interested in men of high intellect and of great accomplishment. That was like the one consistency with all the men that she was involved with: artists and industrialists, people who either they, like her second husband, either they accomplished a lot or in the world of industry or finance, but also, even more important than that, artists and writers. H.G. Wells is probably the most famous one. A lot of political activists, of course, which shouldn't come as a surprise since she was one herself. But that was, so it was to her, it was always a mind meld, you know, me and this man. It's not just about the body, it's about our intellect.
But whether she described it as love is another thing.
Yeah, she wasn't free and loose about that particular word. She wasn't like overly romantic, I wouldn't say. She wasn't, although it's something I've noticed too when you read her letters. All of her existing letters are collected in these 2 gigantic books edited by a woman named Kaplan. And it's hard not to notice that I guess this makes her, like, pretty much like anybody. She responded very positively to men when they'd write to her if they really poured on the mush, you know. So, but I guess, like, they're talking about her beauty and grace and blah blah blah, you know. But who doesn't want to hear things like that? So in many ways, you know.
Did she marry a man like her father?
Her first husband, yes, even though her first husband was Jewish, but her husband was not. Her first husband was not a practicing Jew. And even, that's another very weird, complicated thing about her first husband, is he tried to pass. He tried to pass as a non-Jew. You know, she knew he was Jewish when she met him, and it was very obvious, you know, his own immediate family, who would help take care of her children when they were all small, they still had Eastern European accents, you know, they would all dress in black. They went to synagogue. Her husband didn't. And over time, her husband did everything he could to pass himself off as a non-Jew. And And Sanger, I guess because it's what he wanted, she went along with it. She would pretend. She goes, all right, if you want everybody to pretend you're not Jewish, I'll pretend with you. Which is, some people would interpret that as her being an anti-Semite, but she isn't, since, first of all, she married a Jewish guy and became part of his Jewish family, but also, especially during when she was active in New York City, which was most of her active years, most of her colleagues were Jewish. You know, so many of her best friends and colleagues were Jewish people. So I can't imagine an actual anti-Semite putting themselves right in the middle of this very Jewish world and scene. Now I forgot what I was going to say, but there was a lot in common with her first husband and her father. They were again, like, the word socialist wasn't quite in common usage then, but for all intents and purposes, Sanger's father was a socialist, and so was her first husband. The first husband was like, he was the head, he was the chairman of a socialist chapter of Upper Manhattan. He was extremely active in this, and that had a lot to do with the two of them getting together.
Well, there were still believers in Henry George in recent times.
Henry George was Margaret Sanger's father's hero. He even stayed at the Sanger house, and she had one brother that died in infancy, and his name was Henry George. Henry George Higgins. Higgins was Sanger's maiden name. Sanger was her first husband's name, but her father worshipped Henry George. Who it's so difficult now because times have changed so much. We always try to put people in a box, and when we talked about Henry George, he doesn't neatly fit into what we would in modern times describe as a socialist. You know, there's a lot of anarchists who admire Henry George. It was sort of this agrarian. I think correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know how much you, Stephen, know about Henry George, but wasn't his didn't he believe that all land should be commonly held? That was the main thing, is that no one person should be allowed to own land. Wasn't that his main?
Yeah, well, it makes sense in a time when lands was a clear source of value.
Yes.
But of course, the world sort of moved on a bit from that.
Right.
So they think, this thing with land is a universal panacea.
Right.
Which probably made sense in the 18th century. But
right.
We've sort of gone a little bit past it now, but they still hold on to that.
Right. Oh, am I leaving a question hanging? I can't remember.
Yeah. Well, let's go through this a little. There's a few things I would point out. How much license did you have to extrapolate as to her attitudes? Like, for example, the part here, she's just comes out a little bit disturbed by what has just occurred with the doctor, and she's her emotions overrunning her as she kicks the can here.
Well, I don't know. She didn't say I kicked the can.
Right.
That was the only way I could visually express the intense anger and frustration that she was feeling in the wake of that particular story. And that's a story. It was a story that she would often tell at fundraising events, but there was a woman, she pretty much was an amalgam for a lot of the poor immigrant women that Sanger worked with on the Lower East Side. She named her Mrs. Sachs. Nobody can find evidence of an actual, they've looked through the census records. They can't find anybody that quite fits the bill. So this woman clearly was a mixture. But the story that she would tell was that the woman tried to abort her own fetus, got infected. They were able to nurse her back to health. Sanger did. But then the woman asked Sanger, the nurse, she goes, I know that rich women can prevent getting pregnant. Prostitutes know how to prevent from getting pregnant. Why can't I, or just typical average poor housewife, why can't I know? Is there anything that you could tell me? And Sanger couldn't at the time. She says, I can't tell you anything because if I did, I'd lose my job. I could even get arrested. And so the woman said, as this was all in the strip you just showed, the woman then said, well, what about the doctor? Can the doctor help me? So Sanger said to the doctor that she was assisting, she has these questions about avoiding pregnancy. can you help her out? And the doctor was openly hostile. And again, according to Sanger, the doctor just told the woman, "No, you want advice? Have your husband sleep on the roof." That apparently was the extent of the birth control. And then I didn't show the rest of the story in the comic book, but the rest of the story that Sanger would tell is that same patient, the same woman, she did get pregnant again. She did try to abort herself again, and but that time she did die from sepsis.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
My goodness. Yeah, certainly. They were tumultuous times when
Yes.
she was operating. How long from beginning to end? How long did it take you to do this comic?
The comic book itself, it took me 3 years.
Oh.
Not financially, not worth it. Yeah, like 1 whole year was solid research. I tried to read everything I could find, either by her or about her. And of course, there was a number of books written by her detractors. Like there's one book called Killer Angel, which pretty much is like what you would imagine, where it's like I didn't even recognize the person that the author was talking about. It was so out there. It was so insane.
Yeah.
But
there's a part in the comic. She's talking to a group of people. I can't remember who, but she had a model to show the female reproductive organs.
yes,
and,
her gynoplaque.
Yeah, and the audience replied, "What's a vagina?"
Right.
How much sort of did you extrapolate to that?
Yeah, well, that was so according to her and people who were there, that was something that happened. That was an organization that she spoke to, and again, because of the logistics, because of the connections involved, that organization that she was speaking to was the Women's Auxiliary of the Ku Klux Klan.
Okay.
She was invited by not the Klan themselves, not the official organization, but by a separate, like fraternities frequently back then, when most men were in some fraternity, the Elks Club, the Masons, you name it, Knights of Columbus, they would usually have a female arm, the wives and daughters. They were the ones that invited her to speak. And it was really obvious from the way they went there, when she went there, that the Grand Poobah, the Grand Wizard, whoever was in charge, they did not know that she was coming to speak to their wives. I mean, some of the men knew. There were men that drove her to this meeting, but it was very clandestine. They took all these back alleyways. They clearly were hiding from people. So, and she didn't know, and she didn't ask, but it terrified her. She wasn't terrified of the women she spoke to. They were just poor women who didn't know the first thing about birth control, or even based on that question, what's a vagina? They didn't even know. I mean, obviously the woman just never heard the official medical term for her private parts, you know? But she knew that people were like that. They're still poor people. You know, a lot of people back then, the Klan was at the height of their popularity back then. They had millions of members. But one aspect, you know, and rightly, we think very poorly of them as an organization. But one thing about them that made them different from the Elks or the Rotary Club or the Lions Club is they did accept everybody. It's like, I mean, they didn't accept Blacks and Jews and Catholics, but other than that, you had to be a somebody to join the Rotary Club. You know, you had to be in the professions. You had to be a successful businessman. It wasn't open to everybody. The Klan was for poor white men. For poor white men, they accepted everybody, and everybody wanted to be in a fraternity. There was no Social Security back then, so that's where you literally got your Social Security, was from being in an organization like that. But she said it was really obvious that these women were afraid of somebody, and it must have been the men who ran the Klan. Did not know she was in there, but she didn't want to ever talk about. But it's very, again, her detractors these days, they always bring up the fact that she spoke to this organization. She spoke to the wives of the Klan. They don't describe it as that. They just said she was invited by the Klan itself, the leaders of the Klan. That's not true. And she went there. What she talked about with them is what she talked about with everybody: how to practice safe and effective birth control. That's all. Every talk she ever gave to, that's all it was about. That was her whole point, and why it should be legal. And that's what she shared this information with poor women who happened to be married to Klansmen. And then what's interesting, though, is the mere fact that she talked at this organization. People now would say, well, there's your proof that she's a racist, even though all she did was she was trying to help the wives of Klansmen have fewer babies. I mean, do you want more Klan babies? I don't think so. So she's doing you a favor. And then she would give the same talk or share the same information with Black women. But then all of a sudden it magically becomes, well, there's your proof that she's a racist. She's trying to help Black women have less babies. But it's like, no, the Black women want to have less babies. They don't want to.
There's a bizarre element here.
Yes.
And I've encountered this time and time again. It's the idea she's giving people information.
Right.
It's then their choice.
Right.
But the detractors do not see choice.
Right.
There are only commands.
Right.
Beware the people who believe everything is a command.
Right. And it's unfortunately there's lots of there's somebody like Angela Davis here in the United States, because Sanger, she formed this rather unofficial. She helped form this unofficial project. The other leaders of which were W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois, I mispronounced his name, Du Bois, and other Black leaders. And they asked her. They said, "There's a lot of. Can you help poor Black women have fewer babies because they are having more babies than they can afford?" And they often wind up single mothers, or they start out as single mothers, and this is a terrible thing, and we want to prevent it. You know how, on a strictly practical level, you have the knowledge to prevent it. Will you help us? And now everybody uses that as proof that she was a racist, including Angela Davis. She'll tell anybody who asks, Sanger was a racist. Why, Angela Davis? Why was Sanger a racist? Because she was telling Black women how to keep from getting pregnant. Like Angela Davis doesn't use birth control.
But not whites, apparently.
Right. No, but then you're helping whites. Then you're a racist because you're helping whites. It's completely insane. And I see this conversation. I see this total disconnect. Yeah. On Twitter, go on Twitter and Google Margaret Sanger, and you'll hear and you'll see this conversation.
But the thing is,
Planned Parenthood just distanced themselves. They just detached themselves from Sanger because of this. They know that everybody there, they know this is all BS, but it's hurting fundraising. Again, it's always about follow the money. It's like it's hurting their fundraising efforts to be associated with Sanger because of this BS.
According to this, she opened a clinic staffed with Black doctors in 1930, and she had unbelievably overwhelming support from the Black community. So it just shows how pragmatic she really was.
Right. Yeah, they called it the Negro Project. And she already had a long, a very established birth control clinic and research center in downtown Manhattan. And then, so they opened up a second one in Harlem. And again, it was Mary Bethune, who was a famous Black activist and doctor, and her and Du Bois. They asked her to help form this second clinic. And again, the whole idea was to specifically to help Black women with this for these same reasons. Unfortunately, Sanger's downtown clinic was so backed up with appointments. There were so many women who had to wait so long for appointments that all these white women were then getting appointments in the Harlem clinic. So after a while, you'd go there and it's like, why are all these white women at the Harlem clinic? It's like, we couldn't get into the downtown one. Yeah, no, but I know it was such a sticky wicket. It was like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, I guess. It just became, pardon my French, it just became a shit show in spite of the best intentions of everybody involved. It's just become one excuse after another to demonize her and her reputation.
Well, you portray that very starkly in the book. Yeah. We should probably wrap this up. I think we've gone on over our time, but I mean, this is a graphic novel group. Maybe could you recommend, or why what drew you to the comics field? Like, I think this might have well been done as a direct biography.
Right.
Or something.
Well, there already are excellent, full, straight biographies of Sanger. So in a way, that's already been done. Okay. There's one by a woman named Ellen Chesler. I think it's called Women of Valor. The most recent full-length biography, and it's very good. Now I can't even remember the name offhand, but written by a woman named Jean Baker, who a very good, just in general, an excellent biographer. And again, I can't remember her first name. A woman named Kaplan is the editor of the Sanger Papers. And the only way I could see the Sanger Papers, they're big, thick books. There's 2 volumes. And it has pretty much every letter written to or from Sanger that scholars were able to find. And that's a very fascinating window into her as a person as well. And there's also she herself, she wrote 2 biographies, although she really played fast and loose with the facts in her own biographies. Oh, really? Well, because the point of her biography was to further her cause. It wasn't all about, here's my truth, warts and all, here's everything about me. The purpose was, only reason she wrote those books was to help push her cause. So if it helped the cause to exaggerate this, lie about that, she did it.
It's a proposition, though, is the warts and all. And this seems to be a problem now with the modern leftist movement, as their heroes have to be perfect.
Right. Or everybody's supposed to be perfect.
Yeah.
I know. We've come from an era, we had Oliver Cromwell, who was probably hardly a very nice man, but he said, well, paint me warts and all.
Right.
This is something significant about the Bible. You look at the Bible, and it's not a story of generally not a story of perfect individuals. It's a story mainly of screw-ups.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a warning. So these ancient people were satisfied that the image was that, the truth is not always pretty. Right. There's a warning there.
Right.
But today, what's gone wrong? Right. Suddenly we've got a world of people who think everything should be perfect.
Yeah, I know. No, it's become very unforgiving. People, there's something going on right now where people are we're in almost all traditional religions, even they at least, even though I've spent a lot of time, since we're talking about Sanger, I spent a lot of time criticizing Sanger, but the Catholic Church totally understands that nobody is perfect. And they're all about forgiveness. That's that's the core of their beliefs, is forgiveness. And to give everybody room to redeem themselves. They celebrate redemption. And that's based on the understanding that we're all going to screw up. We are all screw-ups. We're human. It's the human condition. And it was somebody just recently told me some bad story that wasn't even true about a friend of mine. And I said, really? I'm like, I find that hard to believe. That guy's my friend. And she said, hey, well, what can I tell you? Our heroes have feet of clay. And I'm like, he's not my hero. He's my friend. All of a sudden, we can't even forgive we can't even allow for friends to be screw-ups, But I don't, I guess maybe we should be wrapping this up.
Well, I wouldn't mind if you wanted to push some books, plug some things. What are you currently out? I know there's a big Hate collection.
Yeah, I've been doing lots of podcasts promoted. Yeah, Hate is the comic. I did this comic in the 90s. Yeah, it's 3 volumes, very heavy, very expensive, but yeah, it has like 3 volumes inside it. But yeah, this is my latest thing, even though it's comics I did years ago.
Yeah,
it's a collection of comics I did back in the 90s for the most part.
But of course, the world's biggest haters now want to make hate a crime.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I couldn't agree more.
Peter, I apologize for not being more familiar with your work. Are you illustrating as well as narrating?
Yeah, I do. I mean, there's been times where I've just written and times where I've drawn other people's work, but for the most part, I almost always write and draw my own work.
Cool. Wow, that's very cool.
Yeah,
and you're one of the best cartoonists living.
Oh well, thanks, Dave. Thanks a lot. Checks in the mail.
Yeah. This is our graphic novel group. While we go, do you have any recommendations for the next thing we should read?
Do I?
Read that absolutely essential comic.
I've been on the subject of biographical comics,
okay,
or autobiographical, one or the other. The cartoonist, 2 books that I was really super impressed with that are fairly recent is recent work by Bill Griffith, who's best known for Zippy the Pinhead.
We did Invisible Ink just
Okay,
a month
excellent.
ago.
There you go. I was going to recommend that. And also the one he did more recently about Schlitzie. It's called Schlitzie, and it's about the guy who more or less inspired Zippy the Pinhead.
Yeah.
That's an excellent book as well.
I haven't read that one yet, but we did do Invisible Ink. Stephen, what do you remember that one we did? Invisible Ink? You're muted, Stephen.
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah, his mother.
Yes. Yeah, I thought that was
his
a masterpiece.
mother who didn't live up to the goddess image well enough,
Right.
Yeah.
So his mother was the goddess he was seeking, but also she failed as a goddess. So
she had an affair with Lawrence Lariat, the cartoonist.
Yes.
Strange.
Well, anyhow, I should get going, but thanks a lot.
Okay. Thanks very much for being here.
No, I appreciate everybody showing that much interest in the question.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Peter.
Bye.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you.
Peter.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. I'm glad this worked out better than I hoped. Yeah, this was a great session, and I hope if you haven't read the book, please do read the book. It's worth reading, and Peter Bagge is one of our greatest living cartoonists. I really would endorse that position.
Well, thank you for putting it together.
Yeah, I enjoyed the book. I liked it a lot. It's my first graphic novel that I've ever read, and I enjoyed it.
Okay, well, yeah, that's a wonderful medium, and we come here every Friday night, Saturday morning for you guys to talk graphic novels, and we've done some great ones, and we hope to do some good ones in the future. And yeah, I'm glad that this was enjoyable for you to read. And Peter Bagge is a wonderful cartoonist. Absolutely. Yeah, he does the writing and drawing. Yeah. If you haven't read the book, please do.
Thank you, David.
Okay, I'm glad this was a good turnout, and we'll be here next Friday, everybody, or Saturday morning, as it will be. Okay, thanks, everyone. Bye.
What's on next Friday?
Next Friday, I believe, is Sandman. I think
Sandsman. All right. Okay. Cool.
I can change it at the last moment if anybody has any suggestions.
Oh no! I'm just trying to think now. I have heard the name.
Very short.
Sandsman.
Only
Very
30
short.
30 pages. 35.
All right, yeah. Oh, okay.
They're short. I'll send it to you. It's a fantasy. And it's going to be a TV show very soon.
Oh, right.
We're going to do a TV show of it.
Is it the Galactic Railroad or something?
I put it in the category of like Harry Potter-ish type of fantasy, kind of. But it's very adult. It's very, very, very adult, I think. Yeah. But it's short.
The name of the author?
Well, it's written by Neil Gaiman.
Neil Gaiman.
Oh, Neil Gaiman.
The artist is Sam Keith. But we're just going to read issue number 1. I mean, it went on for 74 issues. But we're only going to do issue 1 and talk about it. That's all we're doing. Yeah.
Oh, well, I hope Christopher Robbins isn't struggling too much after I gave him a hard time.
What did you say to him? What?
Oh, he was going on about being his own Superman. I said, you're still living with your parents.
Oh.